At the end of the Second World War, Britain still appeared a great power, with Europe's largest economy and living standards above much of a war-torn continent. But that moment marked a turning point. Over the next 6 decades, Britain would slip from economic leader to economic laggard, a decline that was part inevitable and part self-inflicted. Germany may have lost 2 world wars, but it would go on to win the economic race. In 1950, the UK economy was 80% larger than Germany. By 2022, it was 18% smaller. How did the land of hope and glory become a story of managed decline? In 1946, after 6 years of war, the country was exhausted and almost bankrupt. National debt had surged to its highest level since the Napoleonic Wars. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. Yet, despite its finances resembling more that of a defeated nation, Britain still saw itself as a global power. But with India's independence in 1947, the empire was on the way out. The benefits were fading, but the bills for being a global power kept coming. In 1950, Britain was spending 9% of GDP on defence, compared to virtually zero in Germany. The economist John Maynard Keynes warned that Britain's global ambitions have become a burden. There is no reasonable expectation of our being able to carry it out. But flushed with wartime victory, few politicians wanted to hear it. In 1950, Germany was investing 15% of GDP. Britain lagged behind with just 9%. Britain was spending on prestige and defence. Germany was spending on factories and machinery. The result, within a generation, West Germany had overtaken Britain. Britain had won the war, but was losing the peace. Now, there's a common myth that Britain missed out on Marshall aid, that all the American money went to defeated countries like Germany. But that's not true. The UK actually received $2.7 billion compared to $1.7 billion for West Germany. The problem wasn't a lack of help, it was how the money was used. Instead of investing in modernising industry or rebuilding its economy, Britain spent much of it on imports, defending sterling, and maintaining its global role. Now, the post-war period is not all doom and gloom. The 1945 Labour government created the NHS, the welfare state, and launched a house-building boom. For millions, life truly transformed with rising living standards, longer life expectancy, and an end to the mass poverty of the 1930s. But Britain's economic management still fell short of its potential. In 1946, UK living standards towered over Europe's. By 2022, they had slipped behind countries like France, Netherlands and Germany. Even so, in absolute terms, GDP per person was still 3 times higher than after the war, proof that decline can coexist with absolute progress. Britain's industrial strength had actually been slipping since the First World War. It was losing competitiveness to the United States and struggling to earn enough foreign currency, leading to chronic balance of payments problems. Under the post-war Bretton Woods system, currencies were tied to the dollar, so Britain had to defend the value of sterling to maintain confidence. But a slowing, less productive economy made that increasingly difficult. The inevitable decline of the pound drove up the cost of imports, squeezed living standards, and fueled inflationary pressures, a vicious cycle that became a hallmark of Britain's post-war economy. In the post-war period, the government was also quite interventionist, nationalising key industries, keeping capital controls, and directing business to focus on exports, particularly to the US. In the 1940s, Labour government mandated the West Midlands to focus on car manufacturing and limited housing supply in the centre of Birmingham. It meant that business lacked the freedom to pursue the most profitable areas of growth. In truth, Britain's post-war export policy was more about managing scarcity than creating success. In 1950, the UK was the world's largest car exporter, 25% of the global total. Yet, with a lack of investment, innovation, and troubled labour relations, this lead was squandered. Whilst German and Japanese firms were carving out the market with innovation, excellence, and exciting new models, British Leyland became the butt of jokes. The Austin Allegra, Morris Marina, all guaranteed to break down. At least the Robin Reliant made people smile. Britain, once the workshop of the world, just wasn't very good at making things anymore. Now, whilst European countries were modernising industry and infrastructure, such as the electrification of railways, the UK was still in the era of the steam engine and semaphore signal, the world of the Victorians. The UK had pioneered railways in that Victorian age, but by the 1960s was slashing its own network in the Beeching era. Now, compared to the present day, the 1960s was really a boom decade for global trade and Western economies. The fact that the UK was growing slower than other countries didn't really seem to matter, given the unprecedented growth in living standards, low unemployment, and sense of optimism. The 1960s was an era of the Beatles, social revolution, and developments such as computers, jumbo jets, and walking on the moon. It seemed that even the sky wasn't the limit anymore. Yet behind this facade of exciting developments, UK industry was still struggling. 1967 saw another devaluation and economic humiliation. As Howard Wilson noted, we used to rule the world, now we can't rule our own currency. Yet, if the 1960s dazzled bright, the 1970s was a decade where the lights literally went out. It started off pretty well, strong economic growth, supercharged by the 1973 Barber budget, a kind of Liz Truss on steroids, massive tax cuts, causing economic growth of a scarcely credible 10%. But inevitably this caused an inflationary boom and bust. It was an extreme example of a stop-start UK economy. UK chancellors just couldn't resist the temptation to go for broke, even if it meant stoking inflation. But if Barber had played the wrong cards, his mistake was magnified by the storm clouds of OPEC tripling oil prices overnight. The post-war economy was based on cheap oil, so when oil prices surged, it created havoc. Inflation went through the roof and the economy into another recession. And this surge in inflation opened another Achilles heel of the UK economy. Worsening trade relations, a nation seemingly forever on strike, workers and management stuck in a face-off, us versus them, a classic manifestation of the UK's deep-seated class system. Coal miners, then a vital component of the economy, had seen their wages decline compared to other workers. In 1973, they went on strike, bringing the economy literally to its knees. It led to the 3-day week, lights out at 10 p.m, and a government losing credibility. When Ed Heath's government went to the country with a slogan, "Who governs?" the public replied, "Not you." But for the new incoming Labour government, there was no let-up in economic problems. Inflation, balance of payments crisis never seemed far away. In 1976, with the pound under pressure, the UK had to go cap in hand to the IMF for the then biggest ever bailout. A Treasury official remarked in the 1970s, "The trouble with Britain is that we stopped being a great power, but we never stopped pretending we are." The final indignity was a winter of discontent in 1979, corpses piling up as Liverpool undertakers went on strike. The press had a field day, but the sight of rubbish bins uncollected was symbolic of a nation in decline. However, if Britain was in decline, there was one lady determined to sweep away the crumbling edifice and build something new. To reduce the menace of inflation, Thatcher broke with a post-war consensus. Monetarism was the new religion, tax cuts for the rich, and higher interest rates for the rest. Inflation fell, but unemployment rose to the highest level since the Great Depression. 365 economists told Thatcher her policies were all wrong, but Thatcher retorted, "This lady is not for turning," and she stuck to her guns. Ironically, the 1970s had actually brought some very good news for the UK economy. The discovery of gas and oil in the North Sea, as James Callaghan said, God's gift to the UK economy. But in the 1980s, this discovery actually caused the pound to unexpectedly increase in value, and exporters couldn't cope with the loss of competitiveness. Manufacturing suffered a severe recession, the biggest decline in living memory, a decline that has proved unstoppable. In 1984, The Economist bemoaned, "Once we led the world in shipbuilding, coal and steel. Now we just lead in nostalgia." Whilst the North suffered mass unemployment, wealth and jobs were attracted to Britain's new growth area, finance. London was reimagined, shiny skyscrapers and a hub of global finance. The old regulations were swept away in the Big Bang regulation, and finance flourished. But it was at the cost of a growing north-south divide and an economy dependent on global finance. In the 80s, the UK also became a pioneer of privatisation, selling off state-owned assets to the private sector. It netted the government over $70 billion, but rather like the windfall of a Marshall Plan in the late 40s, this was squandered on current spending and tax cuts for high earners. Across the North Sea, Norway had invested its oil proceeds in a sovereign wealth fund, an investment for a rainy day when oil disappears. But this was too socialist for Mrs. Thatcher. Today, the UK assets are in decline, a looming demographic nightmare, forecasts of debt reaching unmanageable levels. Whilst on the other hand, Norway has a fund of over $1 trillion, which ironically has bought up quite a bit of prime real estate in London. Another cost of financial liberalisation is the UK gained a reputation for being a great place to launder money. Russian money flooded into London, and key assets were sold off to a range of foreign buyers from America to the Gulf states. The new mortgage and finance liberalisation was great for bankers and those who owned properties. A surge in demand caused house prices to soar in value. Social housing had been sold off to the private sector, and none were built to replace them. This contributed to the current shortage and high rents that we see today. Yet the problem with the financialisation of the economy is it was all a big bubble. In 2008, the global credit crisis caused a spectacular crash. The pound plummeted 30%, a reflection of how dependent the UK economy was still on finance. And ever since 2008, the economy has never really recovered, a new era of stagnation. Now, partly this is a global phenomenon, but also a reflection of failed institutions and lack of flexibility in the economy. It leaves the UK with one of the lowest levels of investment and productivity growth in the world. Now, separated by the Channel, the UK has often seen itself as on the edge of the continent. In the early days of the EEC, the UK declined an opportunity to join. It was okay with its Commonwealth. But later, when it saw how quickly Europe was growing, they applied. But the old ally Charles de Gaulle said non twice, and the UK couldn't enter. By 1974, Ted Heath finally persuaded Britain to join. And in the 80s, the growth of a single market was actually welcomed by Mrs. Thatcher, and UK trade with Europe grew strongly. But it was always an uneasy relationship. In 1992, the UK had joined the ERM, the precursor to the euro, a fixed exchange rate against the German mark. But as was often the case for post-war Britain, it was once again the sick man of Europe. Inflation was high, a self-inflicted wound from the Lawson boom of the late 80s, and the government having to keep sky-high interest rates to protect the value of the pound. But it was all a disaster for the economy. 12% interest rates, an overvalued pound, all caused a deep recession and crash in house prices. In ignominy, the pound was forced out, helped on its way by speculators like George Soros. The disaster of the ERM only cemented the growing self-belief of Eurosceptics. Now, in the post-war period, the UK's problem was that actually a lot of people just wanted to leave. Despite 1 million people coming from the former empire, the Commonwealth, the UK had net emigration. The best and brightest were leaving to seek better opportunities abroad. But in 2004, the expansion of the EU saw a growth in net migration from countries like Poland and Romania, and the scale of migration caused a backlash. Euroscepticism grew. But when David Cameron held a referendum in 2016, no one really expected the UK would vote to leave. Yet disenfranchised voters, fed up with stagnating living standards, gave it a punt, and Britain was out on its own. The next 6 years were dominated by what Brexit actually meant, a tortuous debate of backstops, customs union, and a realisation that it was hard to have your cake and eat it at the same time. And before you knew it, the UK was ripping up its free trade with its nearest neighbour and going back decades to a time of custom checks and tariffs. Investment plummeted and growth took another hit. It also absorbed the nation's political capital for the best part of 6 years. Models suggest Brexit is a significant ongoing cost, but these days it is almost lost in the rest of the economic malaise, the highest electricity costs in Europe, the fastest deindustrialisation, some of the worst wage growth in Europe. Now at this point you may think, is it really all that bad? Firstly, in absolute terms, things are definitely much better. If you want to see real austerity, go back to the 40s and 50s when food and clothing were still rationed. It was a real Spartan existence. In the post-war period, many things undoubtedly improved for the better. Real wages increased. The effective cost of household items like washing machines, TVs and cookers fell. We take for granted many things that were infeasible in the pre-war era. Widespread university education, international travel, free healthcare, dare I say it, generous pensions. Also, it would be wrong to only focus on the failings of the UK economy. It still retains some strengths in areas like higher education, film, media, pharmaceutical startups, niche manufacturing, and of course, financial services. Yet at the same time, it is definitely fair to say a few strategic mistakes were made, too many missed opportunities, and a relative decline. Some of it was undoubtedly inevitable. Britain's role in the economy was oversized because of its empire which couldn't be maintained. Nevertheless, there is always a sense that things could have been different. And what does it mean that so much of Britain has been sold off to Americans and other nationalities? This video looks at this interesting development. Thanks for watching. Do let me know what you think and subscribe for the channel. Cheers.